De- Deborati, bonjour.
Hi.
Hi. All right, so we'll start in 1 minute, so we don't have much time, so we'll just give us 1 more minute. All right, so I see it's already 46, so I'll just get started. So welcome everyone. So we won't spend too much time on the introduction because we only have an hour and a lot of things to cover. We are glad to be included in this conference, and on behalf of all the panelists, we would like to thank everyone involved in the organization of this event. So just in terms of a general organization, Dennis, Ryan, and I will start with general comments about the framework of our larger project, which is a volume titled Queer Rayons of Memory, Marginal Sexualities and Identities in the French National Narrative, that we are currently editing and from which this roundtable stems. We'll then turn to our panelists, so Luc Eilders, Noé Gross, and Maxime Foster, who will talk about their specific chapters, but I also see some people in the audience who are also part of this project, so I'll hope they'll jump in at the end of a session during the Q&A. And of course, we'll end with a Q&A. And since we have limited time for that part of the session, please don't hesitate to use the chat to write your questions and comments while the discussion is ongoing, and we'll all monitor that. So I'll get started, and I'll get started by saying that I hope that you were able to attend yesterday's excellent plenary session on post-colonial realms of memory, or read the volume, because our discussion enters in conversation with Etienne Achille, Charles Forsdyke, and Lydie Moudileno's work, and that's on several levels that I will outline. So first, both volumes' points of departure. So namely, the shortcomings of Pierre Nora's influential 7-volume Les Lieux de Mémoire. Indeed, in PRM, so sorry, all the author, I usually use PRM to describe the volume. The author's questions and I quote, French incapacity and or unwillingness to engage with the inherent and increasingly undeniable imbrication of the colonial in the roman national. In particular, they aim to revise the French national narrative by including lieux de mémoire that are, and I quote, deemed unworthy of remembrance or simply considered marginal. So while in PRM, the authors issue an important corrective to expanding sites of memory to include those of the marginal sites of memory pertaining to post-colonial history, our project seeks to continue challenging France's national narrative. And Lydie Moudileno underlined yesterday the necessity and urgency to continue this work within different frameworks, so geographical, historical, and also one thing that I thought was interesting, this aspect of considering other spaces that challenge that physical and abstract lieu, as for example, the digital lieu mentioned by Debarati Staniel. So this call for urgency resonated for us in particular in terms of queer experiences and history, and the necessity to consider the specificities of queer remembering in the French national narrative to go against the annihilating silence that Charles Morris identifies as the struggle of queer life. I mentioned here Morris and his work on archival queer because queer archives stood out when we started to think about the directions of our volume. For example, we thought that Halberstam's plea to reject, and I quote, the archive as simply a repository, and instead approach queer archive as, and I quote, a construction of collective memory, a complex record of queer activity. Taking into account the importance of this complexity, we didn't want, for example, to exclusively limit the contribution to the lieu that Nora classifies, and Charles also mentioned that it was important for PRM. Indeed, we invited our contributors to propose their own lieu and be, in the words of Halberstam, and I quote, the users, interpreters, and cultural historians that wade through the material and piece together the jigsaw puzzle of queer history in the making, a method that is crucial, according to Halberstam, for the queer archive to function. So here I want to stop for a moment on this notion of queer in the making, so that part in the making, and this insistence on the ongoing process that such work involves, which resonates with 4 other notions important in PRM, which were highlighted in yesterday's discussion and with which we also engage. So first, decolonization, which Charles used in the introduction to frame PRM as discentered from Nora's lieu. And there is a fundamental interconnectedness between decolonial and queer work. So scholars focusing specifically on queer decolonial work remind us of the importance to consider, for example, heteronormativity as being part of settlers' narratives and time. A heteropatriarchy, Mark Rifkin, for example, explains, that guides what he calls the allocation of citizenship. Robert Young yesterday reflected on the effective importance of commemoration as non-static, a repetitive process which destabilizes the lieu de mémoire. Within our own volume, we consider, for example, Anne Kvetkovich, an archive of feeling, and I quote, the determination to never forget, by including chapters on pride marches, for example, or narratives of trauma within the duty of memory. Debarati Sanyal also prompted us to go beyond lieu de mémoire within a past-present temporality and suggested to consider futurity and political becoming. Drawing on Munoz in our volume, we also seek to broaden our scope outside the here and now, a framework that Munoz calls a prison, but instead encourage contribution that look at the potentiality for another queer world that Munoz proposes. And finally, Etienne Achille raised the important question of translation. How will our frameworks, mainly grounded in US-based queer theory, translate or subvert to here take Omi Baba's arguments on translation to the French setting? And I'll let Ryan talk about some of those other definitions that we will need to consider in conversation, in translation, and intersectionally, as Denis will later expand on. So Ryan?
All right, thank you so much, Siham. Hello, everyone. I'd like to quickly thank the conference organizers and my fabulous co-editors, Siham and Dennis, and all of our contributors who have already challenged our ideas and pushed them in new directions. I'll use my time today to discuss some of the analogous concepts that Nora's work has influenced, and the ways in which our volume intersects with and responds to these ideas. The critical categories that interest me today move beyond the informative, yet perhaps troubled concept of les lieux de mémoire, forging new ways of understanding space, memory, and minority populations. Here, I'm particularly interested in lieux d'oubli, les lieux de traumatisme, les lieux de précarité, and nœuds de mémoire, or memory knots in English. I'll talk briefly about each of these concepts and then conclude with a few remarks on the important work of Anne Kvetkovich in An Archive of Feelings, which Siham has already mentioned, regarding the issues that surround the so-called queer archive. So to begin with, les lieux d'oubli were theorized or are theorized by Nancy Wood in Vectors of Memory, Legacies of Trauma in Post-War Europe. She argues that these sites of forgetting are spaces that, and I quote, public memory has expressly avoided because of the disturbing affect that their invocation is still capable of arousing, end quote. Guy Boehner, who has taken up Wood's work, calls these spaces variously realms of forgetting or sites of oblivion in Forgetful Remembrances, Social Forgetting and Vernacular Historiography of a Rebellion in Ulster. It's interesting for me to note that Boehner uses a skeletons in the cupboard metaphor to illustrate lieu d'oubli, which inevitably reminds me of the closet metaphor used so often to describe sexuality. At any rate, these spaces are, he writes, where individuals and communities anxiously try to conceal these discomforting skeletons, end quote. The critical motivation behind lieu d'oubli is obvious, I believe, but the work presented in our volume does not just focus on the interplay between remembering and forgetting. Instead, our work engages critical categories that attend to the specificity of queer spaces. One such concept is Sarah Groening's elaboration of lieu de traumatisme, which helps us to better understand certain contexts of marginalization and the ways in which queer subjects record, memorialize, and commemorate queer spaces, as well as the attendant affects that are associated with them. Indeed, Groening reminds us that Nora and other Western historians rely on lieux de mémoire as, I quote, les derniers points d'attache d'une société oublieuse, au sens où ils matérialisent le passé sous forme de monuments qui ont pour chaque charge de rappeler, de maintenir et de démontrer un passé qui n'a pas été intégré dans l'actualité. In contrast to the exclusionary nationalism inherent in lieux de mémoire, Groening instead relies on the work of Edouard Glissant and other theorists of the Caribbean in order to make sense of individual and collective trauma. She argues that le passé antillais exerce un pouvoir traumatisant sur la communauté dans la mesure où celle-ci se voit forcée de le revivre chaque jour tant qu'elle n'a pas encore trouvé de moyens pour l'assumer. Hence, for Groening, following Glissant, les communautés antillaises font un effort pour oublier leur passé largement traumatisant. When transferred to the ideas in our volume, we thus anticipate seeing understudied queer sites that may take up alternating significations of remembering and forgetting, but that are also imbued with effective charge. Another concept that underpins our studies on the specificity of queer spaces is perhaps Églantine Colon's notion of lieu de précarité. For Colon, who argues, I quote, while post-colonial immigrants in France have been largely relegated to the banlieue, deindustrialization has accentuated the precarity of those who live there, bringing to an end both continuous employment and traditional forms of socio-political mobilization, end quote. Colon's focus on the peripheral spaces of Paris is thus motivated by two related elements of neo-capitalism, namely the contemporary discontinuity with regard to the availability of employment within the banlieue and the ensuing economic, social, and ontological precarity that results from it. And I'll just add that Colon's work is all the more interesting here because it was just this past summer in 2021 that the first ever Pride Parade took place in the banlieue in Pantin, Saint-Denis. Perhaps the most valuable intervention into Nora's original ideas of lieu de mémoire would be Rothberg, Sanyal, and Silverman's 2010 concept of nœud de mémoire. Their understanding of these memory knots, as explained in the introduction to their special issue of Yale French Studies, I quote, makes no assumptions about the content of communities or their memories. Rather, it suggests that knotted in all places and acts of memory are rhizomatic networks of temporality and cultural reference that exceed attempts at territorialization, whether at the local or national level, and identitarian reduction, end quote. Rothberg et al. Thus call for a critical category that employs a more flexible approach to the interworking elements of transnational methodologies on the one hand, and the specific iterative or performative nature of remembering on the other. To conclude these brief remarks about some of the concepts deployed throughout our volume, I would just like to quickly return to the ongoing question of the archive, namely its difficulty in recording and preserving queer memories. This is, of course, as Anne Cvetkovich famously makes clear in An Archive of Feelings, more an issue with normative historiography and the straight archives inability to preserve and interpret queer positionalities and their attendant embodied affects than it is an issue of the queer subject's inability to access said archive. Queer realms of memory, we hope, will intervene in ongoing discussions of various queer spaces of remembrance and the ways in which we need to account for the specificity of these queer spaces, as well as the processes by which queer memories are produced. The final point, this something that CM has already brought up, that I'd like to leave you with is that, heureusement, both the editors of Post-Colonial Realms of Memory and Pierre Nora himself seem to invite the types of critical intervention and expansion that are necessary if we intend to deeply understand queer memory making and its spaces. Thank you. I will now pass la parole to Dennis.
Ryan, thank you. So let me reiterate the thanks that Ryan and Siam have given to our organizers of the Winthrop-King Institute conference, and also to our panelists and to our authors for their contributions to our volume that are helping to shape this conversation. So I'll give you first a little bit more contextualization about particularities of France and queerness in France. And then I'll also, like Ryan and Siam, give you some of our thoughts on the additional tools that we hope will help us in this volume, tools that are related to intersectionality, language, and queerness. So first of all, some contextualization. So Nora's shortcomings and omissions of the 1980s on queer memory require a bit more contextualization here. While the Stonewall riots of summer 1969 in Greenwich Village in New York City ignited a series of similar protests and movements among LGBTQ groups throughout the global North, it was not until more than a decade later that LGBTQ visibility in France really started to emerge. Following the presidential election of François Mitterrand in 1981 and the decriminalization of homosexuality in France, a remnant of the Vichy regime, we begin to see the emergence of a multifaceted community and its ability to create collective cultural meaning and memory. Among other sites and cultural productions, this includes the opening of an increasing number of gay and lesbian establishments in the Marais and further afield. Also in provincial cities, we see the same thing happening. Also the publication of personal ads in print media. Do any of you remember the Minitel 3615 Le Téléphone Rose? Publications like Gay Pied and Lesbia, and the creation of those online chat lines with Minitel. Now, with the AIDS pandemic, this would also lead to the Affaire du Sang Contaminé, the creation of ACT UP Paris, the monthly magazine sponsored by Pierre Berger and Yves Saint Laurent called Têtu, the celebration of World AIDS Day with a large pink condom on the Obélisque de Luxor, as well as the tradition of French AIDS fiction from Hervé Guibert, Pascal Deduve, Cyril Collard, and Gustave Dustan, among others. Much more recently, cultural products such as the films of Dolan, Ozon, Siama, and others have come to represent the increasingly global world, as well as the local and national forces that shape it. So as you can imagine, as we think about the volume, these are some of the cultural objects we hope to cover. At the same time, and more recently with the Pacte Civil de Solidarité of 1999, as well as the Loi Taubira, le mariage pour tous in 2014, and other forms of sexual democracy, good sexual citizenship, and homonormativity, some significantly LGBTQ sites are now starting to disappear completely or be absorbed by other non-queer sites. For example, if you think of Les Mots à la Bouche from the Marais, that bookstore has been displaced to another neighborhood. Public cruising areas have almost all but disappeared or been displaced to online hookup sites. Indeed, with the ushering in of new communicative technologies, new sites of relative queer freedom have also emerged, allowing LGBT people to thrive, but not without its own forms of symbolic violence related to stalking and bullying in virtual space, but also continued real physical violence in their everyday lives. So the chapters in our volume aim to contribute to this expanding roman national that is under constant negotiation. within current contemporary political and cultural contexts. To create an archive of feeling and memory, what came before, but what is also now disappearing or shifting because of enduring models of French universalism and its chokehold, as well as global neoliberal forms of citizenship and cosmopolitanism that erase specificities. So some of the additional concepts we will consider in the volume include, obviously, the approach of intersectionality, first introduced by Crenshaw, the imbrication of multiple points of marginal difference in conversation with each other. I want to also point out one of the things that Siam has said in relationship to Halberstam and the queer archive. Some folks in queer linguistics are now referring to this as a scavenger methodology to get at the affect and the queer archive. And so one of the aims then is also to make the argument that neither post-colonial approaches nor LGBT studies approaches themselves can answer these questions as robustly as an intersectional approach, and also a queer framework that looks at multiple forms of marginalization that neither post-colonialism or LGBT social constructions of identity can handle alone. Now, from Achille Forsdyk and Murileno's volume, Sophia Kadraoui Fortune, in her nice essay that I taught yesterday on the abolition of slavery, she's talking about lieu de parole. And so language and lieu de langage are also important. Language and what we refer to in queer linguistics and in other fields as translanguaging. And so I hope that this will also engage with what Etienne was saying yesterday about translation. So related to language, the last two concepts I want to introduce are the flexible accumulation of language. This is something that I've written about at length in Queer Maghrebi French. This is the accrual of scripts of selfhood that one acquires as one moves through different configurations of time and space. The nation and the monolingual place have now been replaced with the multinational, the transnational, the multilingual, and the translanguaging. And then related to that, this also has to deal with transfilial, transgressive, and unfaithful realms of memory. And so transgressive and transnational ties to kinship and belonging that form outside of the roman national. And I'm using here an example from the readings that I've done recently of Abdalataya and this notion of unfaithful realms of memory. Les lieux de mémoire infidèles. So an unfaithful realm because even at a young age, queer Maghrebi French speakers like Abdalataya may have been looking to the Hexagon and Paris as the post-colonial Mecca. However, they were also already watching Chinese Kung Fu films and watching US Western films and reading US novels and finding their points of identification and their semantic anchors from figures like Bruce Lee, Marilyn Monroe, and James Baldwin. Their references were not only Cocteau, Gide, and Genet. So with this introduction to the volume kind of now laid out for you, we'll now turn to some examples from our other panelists. Thank you. Luke, would you like to go first? Luke Alderts from Southern Connecticut State University.
Well, thank you again to the organizers of the conference. Thank you again to Dennis, Ryan, and Siam for organizing this edited volume. I'm very, very honored to be a part of it. And today I'm going to talk very briefly about my contribution and then look again at some of the traces that I am analyzing. So let me jump right into my remarks. So, as I said, the objective of my chapter is to examine the ways in which Strasbourg's Marche des Visibilités carves out and queers the spaces it occupies while simultaneously fostering the creation of a queer mobile lieu de mémoire through its physical and digital traces, as well as its symbolic kind of filiation with similar events within France and beyond. So, Gay pride parades have often been one of the most public and spectacular demonstrations of a visible and suggested coherent community of queer people. While the first pride demonstrations took place in the United States, marches have traveled the globe and been translated to suit different national and local settings. With varying degrees of politically charged messages and festive atmospheres, gay pride demonstrations have allowed participants the ability to come together and carve out a queer space in the public sphere. Despite differences in location and local flavor, many French pride parades share this common thread. They come together, come to life, not only in a space normally reserved for the usual activities of traffic and exchange, but also in those historically charged lieux, where they engage in a kind of dialogic relationship with the streets and squares they travel through, the buildings and monuments they pass by, as well as the spectators and participants who join or leave the march. Many are displaced and disrupted while the parade traverses the city, thereby forging this kind of ephemeral space where the visibility of queer bodies and the traces they leave year after year creates this kind of mobile lieu de mémoire, one that, like memory itself, remains unstable and ever-changing. As Pierre Nora has written, not only does memory remain, I quote, in permanent evolution, end of quote, just like the participants and spectators themselves, but it is also, open the quote again, by nature, multiple and yet specific, collective, plural, and yet individual, close the quote. While each year paths through the city may differ, participants and spectators may change, one of the things that I find kind of interesting about this is that there's this regular return of the demonstration. This regular return of the demonstration itself fosters this production of a kind of collective memory, one that looks obviously behind, but also looks forward. And it's a system by which the march is kind of able to transmit from one generation, if you will, of participants to another, a kind of sense of belonging to a cohesive community of queer people through a kind of almost, as Nora has said, commemorative vigilance, this imperative to remember and keep the fight going. Indeed, it is this vigilance, this push to remember, and the invoking of these queer filiations that one can see in the flyers of Strasbourg's Marche des Visibilités that is one of the things that I'll be looking at. So for example, links to the New York Stonewall riots of 1969 as kind of this founding myth, if you will, this original lieu de mémoire, the language choice that heightens the community's bond, oftentimes using imperatives, first person plural imperatives, we must, for example, and also reminders that the fight continues. So kind of carving out again this idea that there is a community, there is this cohesive community, and we must remember to keep the fight going. These flyers act not only as objects to advertise, of course, the time and theme of the march, but also traces to be tucked away and taken home afterwards by individual participants to remind them of their connections to that day and occasion, and to relive any number of feelings they may embrace having viewed or joined the celebration, whether they were a participant or possibly a spectator. Moreover, by carving out a queer space and demanding to be seen year after year, I argue that the march and its participants force open a space for themselves within this fabric of a nation whose Republican discourses have often aimed to silence them, thereby offering kind of an altered understanding of Frenchness to take from the volume on post-colonial realms of memory. Of course, one of the interesting things about that erasure, of course, is usually with Strasbourg specifically, after the march passes by, kind of, if you will, the representation of the state in the form of street cleaners comes by and erases more or less all traces that the march has come through, at least the center of the city. And finally, of course, in the spirit of post-colonial realms of memory, my chapter, I hope, will add to this disruption of, I quote, a nationally focused understandings of sites of memory by integrating sexuality and queerness into the practices and study of collective memory. If you will allow me just 1 second, I'll show, I have just a couple images of those flyers that I'd just like to quickly show you. So for example, the Strasbourg March has been going on since 2002. It has a rather interesting beginning. It was supposed to start in 2001, but at the time the politically right mayor, Fabienne Keller, said no, and she had some very interesting things to say about why this private kind of event should not be happening in the public sphere. But in any case, to take a look at some of these images. So for example, this is one of my favorite. In 2003, we have again this kind of example of almost like an evolution. So again, really kind of trying to play on that idea of that there's a past, there's a future, of course, a little bit with the joke, of course, that at its most evolved, the queer community is what appears to be, one would maybe say, a drag queen with the of course, carrying the flag of the arc-en-ciel. 2005, of course, calls very kind of locally on the kind of the queer community of Alsace, making use of images of the cigogne or the stork. Of course, queering it a little bit with then the addition of the peacock feathers in again rainbow colors. And if you squint, this is something that I've always kind of seen as well. It's almost also in the shape a little bit of kind of the nœud d'Alsace, kind of the Alsatian bow, again kind of recalling those images from the Alsatian and Lorraine annexation after 1870. But we have a lot of images, for example, again, of kind of this collectiveness, the raised fists. Of course, we've always got generally the arc-en-ciel, the rainbow colors, again, kind of as a symbol that kind of goes through most of these images. Oh, no, that's not what I want to do. Let me, oh, there we go. In 2008, again, to talk about trauma, again, an idea that was just recently mentioned as well, although maybe not necessarily the most professional of flyers that was produced. What is interesting again here is we have, again, this bringing forward again these issues of a community that is in danger, the adolescent community with its high suicide rate, and we have again that language, the first person plural kind of imperative that we need to act. So again, this flyer kind of bringing together this community. In 2009, we are commemorating again the Stonewall riots. And the language used again, ensemble, se souvenir pour mieux agir. So again, kind of creating this link, this filiation with other events. Again, Stonewall kind of being the first example. But again, Strasbourg is an example of gay pride parades, but they're all over, again, generally the industrialized North. I think even just this year, for example, France saw the most number of gay pride parades in France alone. Again, it was probably a desire of people wanting, since we weren't able to commemorate last year's event. I'm going to skip forward because I know I'm probably taking a little bit too much time. But also the path of the march. One of the things that I've always found very interesting is the space this march takes up in this event, and the fact that it calls upon other sites within kind of Alsatian memory. So for example, on the right hand of the screen, you'll see this number 3, that's the Place de la République. But this whole site was actually built under German annexation. So this site has multiple layers already, with the French state having come in after World War I and renamed everything. It used to be, this was the Kaiser Square. Now it became the Place de la République. And now very symbolically, the march always passes through it. And one year has even placed, for example, a symbolic seed to again kind of give that idea of memory. In 2005, for example, the march ended in front of the train station, again further giving that idea, this connection to other events across France. And finally, I'll close with having begun 20 or so years ago under a mayor who was not favorable to any event commemorating anything to do with sexuality on the streets of Strasbourg, to today, where now the same tram that was displaced by the event year after year has now been wrapped in again a rainbow flag. So again, that kind of that continued kind of memory work continuing into the future as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So Maxime, if you're ready.
Yes, I am. So yeah, my contribution will be an analysis of Leila Slimani's recent book, Le Pays des Autres, which was published just last year, 2020. It's now, I think, already translated and available in English. It's a project for her which is autobiographical, and I think another volume will be published soon. So this is mostly inspired by her, the story of her grandparents, and it's a historical fiction, which is set in the early 50s in Morocco, just when the independence is on its way. You may have noticed that there is a new tendency, which is very strong and international, which is the use of historical fiction to precisely give a visibility to the people who were erased in the past. So I'm thinking, for instance, to give you a few examples, I'm thinking of The Prophets, the novel The Prophets, which was published by Robert Jones Jr., and which gives space and representation for the first time about homosexuality going on within the slaves. So it's a love story between two slaves in America. And I'm also thinking of the Netflix series Alguien tiene que morir, somebody has to die, which also gives historical representation of homosexuality during the Franco years in Spain in the 50s. So there is a tendency to use both movies and literature on the basis of historical fiction to actually give a face and I wouldn't say rewrite history, but precisely make sure that the people who were erased and excluded from representation find afterwards actually a place in the national discourse about their representation. So what I'm going to use, theoretically speaking, in my analysis of Le Pays des Autres, I'm going to mostly use Gerard Hayes' book, Queer Nations, because Gerard Hayes laid out how to precisely use literature as a counter discourse, which is a deconstruction, a critical take on the national discourse, which tends to give always this very simplistic vision of one nation, very uniform, with one language, one religion, and one sexuality, which is a patriarchal, heteronormative sexuality. So in his study, he specifically focused on Francophone literature from the Maghreb to see how literature was actually offering an alternative discourse and an alternative space for all the people who were, he would say, excluded, I would say erased from the national propaganda, the nationalistic vision of how that should be represented. So I think that's exactly what Leila Slimani is doing in Le Pays des Autres, and not just with homosexuality, but I will specifically focus on one character, the character of Mourad, who was in France during the Second World War, and who was in love with Amin, who was also another soldier. And when they came back to Morocco, Amin ended up marrying a French woman, Mathilde, and they have this enfant métis, which is the whole very interesting, again, perspective on Morocco as being already a hybrid country. And here we can think of the title, Le Pays des Autres. So that's another vision, perspective on Morocco. But I will focus on Mourad as precisely giving a face and a dignity to a Muslim, gay, or homosexual citizen in Morocco just before the independence. That's the kind of character who was, that we never find almost anywhere else in the Moroccan literature. So by doing so, she is definitely willing to show us that Morocco has never really been what the nationalistic discourse pretended it was. And she's making sure to correct or recorrect, I mean, redefine history so that she can actually project herself also for her fight for a better and more inclusive Morocco in the future, because historical fiction is all about the future, actually, paradoxically. So I think I think this book, Le Pays des Autres, really fits with her previous book, Sexe et Mensonges, La vie sexuelle au Maroc, in which she was already fighting to give dignity and visibility to Moroccan women, sex workers, lesbians, gays, who are part, and transgender, who are part of the Moroccan society, but are constantly erased. So I think that her whole attempt to, through this historical and autobiographical fiction, is to really make us understand that sexual minorities, I mean, should be definitely part of the history, and I think it will. I think she's really making history by doing this, by the publication of this novel, and voila. So that will be my contribution. It's basically to try to theorize how literature can stand as a lieu de mémoire by giving space to these sexual minorities. Merci pour votre attention.
Merci, Maxime. Bravo.
Maxime. Okay, so we were supposed to had a third panelist, Noé Gross, but he apologizes for not being able to be present. So his chapter focuses specifically on Didier Ribon and Édouard Louis, and the role of the past to shape and create a political discourse in the present. But if you would like to enter in conversation with that specific topic with Noé Gross, he's welcoming, of course, your email, and we'll share it in the chat. So we now have 15 minutes, actually 15 minutes for discussion, questions. So please feel free to just jump in. It doesn't have to be a question, could be also comments on a specific points that we have brought up during the discussion. So I'm thinking maybe I see Charles and Etienne are here. Maybe any comment on PRM and QRM, as I call them. And also we have a few of our contributors that are also here, not trying to call anybody out, but I see Thomas, Melanie, I see Todd as well, and Corey. So if anyone wants to jump in as well to just give a few words on their contribution for the volume, feel free to do so. And of course, you can use the chat feature or just raise your hands and we will. So we have a question I see from Shadia Chambers. Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry if it's very basic. I'm not very knowledgeable. I'm still learning. But we mentioned Abdallah Taya and Slimani, who are both of Moroccan origins. And I was wondering, I just discovered Slimani, so I am behind. I'm sorry if it's a stupid question. But my question was, do we have some insight on the reception of this work, like both in Morocco, but also I'm interested in the reaction of Muslim people in France, how they react to the work of Abdallah Taya and of Leila Slimani. Is there any work on the reception of this?
Maxime, do you want to take Slimani? To my knowledge, and Ryan, you can jump in with Taya too, and Siam, bien sûr. To my knowledge, for Taya in France, I mean, I think most of his success is coming from a non-Moroccan audience.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be interesting to see if his work has been taken up in reading groups of North African immigrants in France or French people of North African descent. Ryan, I don't know. Siam, do you know anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think Taya is more known in academic settings, so university settings, also libraries, right? He does a lot of readings in libraries, but he's not that popular writer, right, that you see like in demand. So that's a good point, that how to switch that discourse, right, from this academic setting to a more popular setting for Taya. It is, I mean, it is in Morocco already, like he's known because of his public rights intervention, like on TV, for example, and all the festivals that make the news every time he has a screening. But in France, yeah, that's a good question, and I think it deserves actually more inquiry.
I'll just to follow up on that. Oh, I'm sorry, Shadia, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering because I just read Slimani for the first time. I loved it, and I sent it to a friend of mine who is originally from the Maghreb, and the reaction was not the one I expected. It's just anecdotal, but I was struck. So I think the person almost felt offended and attacked, and the culture. So I was just wondering. To me, that was eye-opening and wonderful, and I really wish we had more of this, and we need it. Both French Moroccans and Moroccan people need that discourse to become more public. But I was just intrigued by this reaction, and since you guys are specialists, I thought I'd ask you.
I'll just follow up with that. So I don't know about actual like studies of reception, but anecdotally, I do know that Taya has published one book translated into Arabic. Le Jour du Roi has been translated into Arabic, so that's accessible to a wider population in Morocco. But so the question of language is again, coming up. Often the books written in French aren't read that widely in Morocco. But I will say that his film has traveled throughout the Maghreb and also the Mashrek, and has won a lot of awards in like the film circuit, the film award circuit. So that might be something that's a little bit more accessible and transportable into other, because it uses both French and Arabic languages. So
it's also interesting to note that they are friends, Abdella Taya and Leila Slimani. They made an interview together. They come from very different social backgrounds, but they are really, I think, on a strategic alliance when it comes to promoting women and sexual minorities. And I think they both understand that their fiction is, I mean, it's really the littérature engagée. Le Pays des Autres, I think it's her first novel which deals directly with Morocco, because her previous novels are set in a French context. So that's also a very, I mean, I think it's a switch, a new step in her career to tackle Morocco and on such an intimate level. It really contrasts with her previous publications, but I think it will be interesting to see how they both keep the fight going for a more inclusive Moroccan society.
Thank you so much.
I thank you for your question. And so I see we have Etienne who has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Yam. Thanks for a great panel and a very exciting project. This is very good. My question has to do with the idea of nœud de mémoire that was mentioned in the introduction. And this is very interesting to me because we, in the PRM volume, we address one aspect of NORA's shortcomings while creating our own gaps and lacuna. For instance, the question of queerness is basically absent from our volume. The word queer appears once in 400 pages in Jeanne Duval account by Mireille Rosello. And so I was wondering if, of course, this is a missed opportunity, obviously, but also maybe also a symptom of us having to focus on one facet because there is so much to do to supplement a récit national that is so limited in the first place that I don't know to which extent we can actually think in terms of intersectionality, or if we are condemned, for now at least, to address those gaps one at a time until we're able to think a bit more in terms of intersections. So I'm wondering what was your position and thoughts about this challenge as editors and authors?
Yeah, I mean, since I'm the one who brought up intersectionality, maybe I should take that question difficile. Thank you, Etienne. It's good to see you. Yeah, I think because we are now aware of intersectionality, it would be difficult, in my opinion, to just fill the gap and not also do both of that type of work at the same time, I guess, is how we move forward, you know. I don't know how the other two co-editors think about this, or how the authors think about this, but I think, you know, we're creating, at least in my mind, the QRM volume will be like the PRM volume. It's a trace of memory, it's a trace of history, and it's important to make sure that it's recounted before it disappears. And so in some ways, it's got to fill the gap of those communities and their particular memories. But that maybe intersectionality is an enhancement of that, and will help us kind of think about, you know, as we think about the conclusion of what this volume will look like, who else do we invite to take on similar book projects? So there would be PRM, there would be QRM, there would be, you know, maybe trans TRM, although there'll be some of that in the QRM. My hunch is that in the 21st and the 22nd century, shit, we're already in the 21st century, but my assumption is that by the 22nd and 23rd centuries, there will be identities then that are not currently visible. And so it's always a project in the making. I didn't answer your question, but.
Thank you for bringing that up, Etienne. I think that, so the memoir, you know, with Rothberg, in that introduction to the Yale French Studies special issue, Rothberg says that this is actually not the work of any one theorist. This is the work of all of us together. It requires that interdisciplinary attention to understanding all realms of memory, not just queer or otherwise.
And I mean, if we want to really challenge, right, that notion of uniform, like nationhood by specific markers, intersectionality, even though everything cannot be covered, that's true, needs to be at the core of everything. And that's one of the main arguments of intersectional feminists, right, against that, the use of intersectionality to go against, transcends, right, that limits the limits of nationhood. So indeed, yeah, yesterday during during the discussion for PRM, it's true, it came to mind, like with all the questions where people were suggesting, what about Quebec? What about this? And what about, you know, where are the limits? But I think that, yeah, indeed, we can recognize, as you did, that, right, you did not include queerness, but you did include other intersectional aspects. So that's basically our position, to not just have this little limited category. Even if we're using the word queer in itself is intersectional, right? Like in the different identity that it regroups, but we're also using like gender, right? Sexuality, different geographical spaces within that narrative. And I think you do that, right? As well. So thank you.
Debrati, could you talk more about the wildness? Her question in the chat talks about Halberstam's wildness.
Well, I'm thinking more generally about Halberstam. I actually just got it and just started reading it, so I can't like summarize it yet, but I have been thinking about Jack's work on architecture and wildness and all the different ways in which the archive is being reconceptualized. And I was just curious about how that helps in, because part of what we're talking about are archiving sites of memory, but that are also, as you were suggesting, opening out to different formations, right? Future formations, perhaps. So I was just curious about that. I mean, it sounds like the queer art of failure has been important for—
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, the queer art of failure was important to me in thinking about the flexible accumulation of language and how language accumulates over time, Luke mentions filiations, and I talk about trans filiations. And for me, when you think about queer people, and if we're not getting married and adopting children or having our own children, who are our children? And so thinking about how through representation we are making our own children and our own legacies. And so transfiliation and future are part of that in terms of telling a story for the future. I haven't read Halberstam's Wildness, so now I have to. But I think Siam also talked about it from Munoz in terms of futurity and utopias, and but I now I need to think about wildness as well.
But I think we can also think about Berlin's, right, crisis, or like the notion of crisis. When we think about this destabilizing those lieux de mémoire, like as fixed, crisis is important in queer theory, right? As something also that look at futurity a different way, not as something as like cruel optimistic, right? Like as something that should be pessimistic. So I think that will be, and thank you for the reference, that will be a good parallel to make between Halberstam and Berlin as well.
Mm-hmm. Charles, we know it's late for you there. What are you doing? Maybe he's not at his computer. There he is.
I'm listening intently, and no, just I haven't really got anything to add to what Etienne said, other than to say how we really welcome this companion volume, and looking forward to dialogues between the two, and not crucially not just within our own scholarly community, but beyond.
Yeah. When Etienne asked that question, I mean, what would be a third volume? Is there a third volume, or does intersectionality cover it? And I don't think it does. I think this will push other volumes for sure. And I know the conference will push other volumes for sure.
It's a book series. There's a question. I'm sorry. Charles, sorry.
No, I was just saying, see, a third volume for us in terms of diversification is going into the wider Francosphere as well. So that there's still a geographical project as well. But yeah, no, I shall.
I like Gabarati put in the chat, unrealming memory. I love that.
And there was a question also in the chat, so it went directly to me. So from Joachim, so about speaking of representation, what contribution have you gotten, if any, from other queer, Black, African author or activists we are approached by, that were approached in your project, and not only Francophone writers from Afrique Noire? Yeah, I can answer this question. So we are currently seeking contribution from people and members, activists from the collective Case Rebelle. I don't know if you know, who just published a book called Afro Trans, but that's definitely something that we want to include. So, and that can lead me to maybe add that the project is not complete, right? So we still have room for some additional chapters if that panel inspired you and you thought about some other lieu that you've been also addressing in your own work. So feel free to contact us in the chat. So. All right, I think we have 2 minutes left, and I was asked to give a few minutes at the end for closing remarks. So I would like to thank again the organization and organizers of this conference, as well my two co-author with who it's a pleasure to always work, so Ryan and Dennis, as well as our two panelists, Maxime and Luc. We're looking forward forward to read your full chapter. We'll send you, we'll remind you of a deadline soon. And also some of the other contributors that came today to also think further about the dialogue and discussion that we are planning on having in the volume. And again, Etienne and Charles, I don't think I see Lydie, but this project really directly came from specifically your panel during the conference in Tucson for CFC about 2 years ago. So it went from discussions to an actual concrete project. So thank you also for attending the panel. And I do not know, I think I see Martin, yeah, who might want to take over for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Siham, and thank you to Dennis and all the other editors for sharing your really wonderful work with us. It's really inspiring. And, we often work in isolation, but, this kind of teamwork and this kind of cross-volume, cross-disciplinary interests and collaboration and solidarity, I think is really important. And it's really quite inspiring as well. So we thank you for sharing that work with us today. And yeah, just a couple of words, just the thank you at the end of the conference. It seems to have passed really quickly. But yeah, I'm really grateful to all of the presenters. These are really busy times, unusual times. And I want to thank you for all the work you've put into your presentations. I think they've been uniformly just excellent, really, and really impressive level of contribution. And yeah, everyone else involved in the organization, Rasha, our office manager, does just a wonderful job always. And our IT team have really ensured that everything just went so smoothly with the panels, and it's just gone like a dream. So we thank David and all the other guys involved in that. Just a couple of things about the presentations, the videos that people sent. Our intention is to keep them available for a little while longer, a couple of weeks at least, and we will write to you next week to see whether that is okay with you or whether you want to have your video and the panels as well as part of a more permanent archive of the conference. I think it's important to have that, really, because these are important volumes, important issues that people are addressing, and I think it's going to be of worth to people in the future. So we will be in touch about that, but for now I want to thank you all really sincerely for bringing so much energy and insight to the conference, and we hope to see you again. I'm sure we will, in person or online, hopefully in person. And until that time, we wish you every success with your work. And if there's anything that we can ever do to help people or to collaborate, we're always open to that. So it's in that spirit that we say goodbye. Thank you, and yeah, hopefully see you soon.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, everyone.